Mr. Kenneth rolled down his window, stuck his head out into the cool night air, and put the car into gear. He seemed to instinctively know how to find the thug's car. He trailed them at a distance, which was pretty great, considering the noise coming from Mrs. Grimm's old rust bucket, driving high into the hills overlooking Ferryport Landing. They passed no other cars, just a few deer that darted into the forest as soon as their headlights hit them. But Sabrina was in no mood to enjoy the scenery. Mrs. Grimm's sanity seemed to slip further away with every passing moment. Now the crazy old woman was stalking three dangerous men. It was clear to Sabrina that running away couldn't wait a second longer. They had to make a break for it the first chance they got. Eventually, Tony's car pulled into the empty driveway of a small mountain cabin. Mr. Kenneth pulled off the road as well, then turned the engine and lights off. As soon as they came to a stop, Mrs. Grimm fumbled through her handbag, taking out a pair of odd-looking binoculars with red lenses. "What are those?" Daphne asked. "They're called infrared goggles. They help me see in the dark," the old woman said as she handed them to Daphne. "Want to take a peek?" Daphne raised them to her eyes. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "Terrifying!" "What?" Sabrina looked out the window but saw nothing. "What do you see?" she asked nervously. "You!" the little girl giggled. "Here, take a look." The older girl stuck out her tongue and took the goggles from her sister. When she looked through them, she saw the darkness illuminated in green light. She quickly spotted the three thugs going into the cabin. "Is this really a good idea?" Sabrina asked. "Those men wanted to kill you at the hospital. If you don't care about yourself, shouldn't you at least be worried that they might hurt us?" "You are such a warrior. Let's sit for a bit and see who else turns up," Mrs. Grimm said. "Sabrina, would you mind letting Elvis out? He probably needs to stretch his legs." Sabrina handed Mrs. Grimm the goggles and opened the door. Elvis lumbered out, causing the car to make noises that sounded like squeals of delight. It was the perfect time to run. The girls could use the woods for cover as they made their escape, but Daphne was leaning on the front seat asking questions. "Granny Rhoda, are all the fairy tales true?" "Almost all of them, but some are just bedtime stories to get kids to go to sleep. For instance, a dish never ran away with a spoon." "How about the three little pigs?" Mr. Kenneth shifted in his seat, but said nothing. "Yes, dear, they are real," Mrs. Grimm replied. "How about Snow White?" "She's a teacher at Ferryport Landing Elementary. We're going to enroll you there in a couple of weeks. She's very sweet and, as you know, very good with little people like yourselves." "What about Santa Claus?" "I've never met him, but I have it on good faith that he is alive and well." Sabrina poked her sister, but the little girl swatted her away, too caught up in the conversation to notice their perfect opportunity to make a run for it. "I've got a question for you," Sabrina said. "These stories were written hundreds of years ago. How could all these people still be alive?" "Magic," Mrs. Grimm explained, as if it were obvious. "Yeah, magic. Duh," Daphne said. Sabrina shot her an angry look, but the little girl ignored it. "Granny Rhoda, have you ever seen a giant?" Daphne asked. "Of course, Liebling. I've even been to the giant kingdom on a couple of occasions. The last time I was nearly squished by the giant queen's toe." Mrs. Grimm laughed. "Well, if there really are giants, how come we haven't seen any yet?" Daphne asked. "Well, a long time ago, the Ever After community decided that having giants running around Ferryport Landing was going to draw too much attention. Plus, giants are very unpredictable. They cause as much destruction when they're happy as they do when they're unhappy," Mrs. Grimm explained. "Once they get comfortable, it's impossible to move them. Too, imagine trying to plant seeds on your farm with a sleepy giant lying across it." So some folks came to our family and asked for help. Your great-uncle Edwin and your great-aunt Matilda dipped into our supply of magic beans." Sabrina coughed, hoping to get Daphne's attention, but the little girl shot her an angry look and turned back to the old woman. Edwin and Matilda planted a few and tricked the giants into climbing up the beanstalks. Once they were up in their home world, the Cloud Kingdom, Edwin and Matilda chopped the beanstalks down. What good did that do? Daphne asked. Without giant beanstalks, there's no way for giants to come down here. Of course, not everyone was happy. In the old days, folks planted magic beans and climbed up the beanstalks just to steal the giant's treasures. It was dangerous, but if you were successful, you could make a fortune. Like Jack? Daphne asked. I know that story. You are correct, Liebling. Jack robbed lots of giants and killed quite a number of them too. In his day, he was very rich and famous. They used to call him Jack the Giant Killer. Are you going to sit here and tell us that Jack was a real person? Sabrina snapped. Now he works at a man's big and tall clothing shop on Main Street, Mr. Kenneth said. Granny, if all the beanstalks were destroyed, how did a giant get down here? Daphne asked. Liebling, that is the very mystery we are trying to solve, Mrs. Grimm said, taking out her notebook and flipping through her scribbles. I believe someone planted a magic bean just to let a giant loose. We know his name is Englishman. We know he was going to videotape the giant, and we know he's got a bunch of goons working for him. There's one loose end, though. How did this Englishman get his hands on a magic bean? I was sure they were accounted for and locked safely away. And we have to figure out why this guy would want to let a giant loose in the first place, Daphne said. She jumped up and down in her seat like an excited puppy. It was obvious to Sabrina that her sister was falling in love with the old woman's stories. This is ridiculous, Sabrina grumbled. Just then Elvis let out a low growl. Someone's coming, Mr. Kenneth warned as headlights flashed behind them. Everyone, get down, Mrs. Grimm urged. They all squatted down and waited as a car passed by and parked on the side of the road. The old woman held her goggles to her eyes and studied it closely. Well, Sabrina, we've got more evidence for your theories. That's Mayor Charmy's car, Mrs. Grimm said. He and Mr. Seven are knocking on the cabin door. Mr. Kenneth rolled his window down and sniffed the cool mountain air. His nose curled up as if he smelled something foul. Elvis had the same expression. Child, get the dog back into the car, Candace said to Sabrina. There's Tony. He's arguing with Charmy about something, the old woman continued, still looking through her goggles. Wait, there's someone else at the door. Get into the car, dog, Mr. Kenneth shouted at Elvis. The Great Dane ignored him. He was busy sniffing the air and whining. Something's happening. Charmy and Seven are running back to their car. Something has spooked them, Mrs. Grimm remarked, and you won't believe who's with them. Sabrina braced herself. It was time to go. Candace was distracted by the dog, and the old woman was busy peering into her goggles. They wouldn't get a better chance. She grabbed her sister's hand and pulled Daphne out onto the road. What are you doing? Daphne cried. We're getting out of here this minute, Sabrina said. Elvis let out another horrible whine. It was followed by an earth-shaking thump that sent the girls tumbling to the ground. What was that? Sabrina asked, trying to stand. Get into the car, Mr. Candace ordered. His face was dark and serious. Forget it. We're not playing your crazy games any longer, Sabrina cried as she scrambled to her feet, then helped her sister do the same. Oh dear, Lieblings, please, do as Mr. Candace says, Mrs. Grimm begged. Something is coming. Something is coming? Is it a giant? Maybe it's a tooth fairy. The Easter Bunny? Do you really think we're that dumb? I don't want to hear another word about fairies and goblins, giants, and Jack and the Beanstalk, Sabrina raged as Elvis let out a shrieking howl. I know the difference between reality and a fairy tale. Something fell out of the sky and stole the words out of her mouth. It was a monstrous hand that snatched the car off the ground. Sabrina couldn't believe what she was seeing, even though it was right there in front of her. Her eyes traveled higher and higher. The hand led to a massive arm, then bulging shoulder, and finally to an ill-shapen head. Boils as big as birthday cakes pocked its greasy skin. A broken nose zigzagged across its face. One dead white eye seeped pus. Hands as thick as tree trunks jutted out of the nostrils. It wore the hides of dozens of gigantic animals, including the head of what looked like a giant bear for a helmet. The dead bear's sharp fangs dug into the creature's bald scalp, threatening to pierce its brain. Its boots were made from hides, and tangled in the laces were several unfortunate saplings. The giant lifted the family car up to its repugnant face and looked inside like a child inspecting a toy. With its free hand, it picked its nose. "Where's the Englishman?" it bellowed. "Why does he hide from me?" The car was so high up and off the ground that Sabrina couldn't see what was going on inside it. The giant gave it a terrible shake, and she watched something fall out, landing with a clang at her feet. When she looked down, she realized it was the old woman's handbag. "You cannot hide from me, Englishman!" the giant shouted as it lifted its enormous leg and stomped down hard on the little mountain cabin, flattening it like a pancake. Pieces of timber and stone flew into the air, missing the girls by inches. Sabrina and Daphne gasped. Had Tony, Steve, and Bobby managed to get out? The giant let out a sickening laugh. It stuffed the car into a greasy shirt pocket, lifted its other humongous leg, and walked away, carrying the remains of the mountain cabin and the treads of its boots. The earth shook violently with each step, and ripples spilled across the land, like the disturbance a stone makes when it plunges into a pond. Because of its mammoth stride, the giant completely disappeared over the horizon in no time. Only the distant rumbling of its footfalls remained. The girl stood completely frozen, while Elvis howled and barked. "She was telling the truth!" Sabrina gasped. "You were snubbed her the whole time, and now we might never see her again!" Daphne cried, reaching down to scoop up Granny Rowland's handbag. Then she turned and marched down the road. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to rescue our family," the little girl called back without stopping. Chapter 5. Elvis sniffed the air wildly. Sabrina could see that he took his guard dog duty seriously. Every little buzz and cracking sound needed to be investigated. The dog darted back and forth, peering through the barbed wire fence that separated the road from the endless forest. Once he was confident that the swaying limbs of the pines or the occasional rooting woodchuck was not a giant sneaking up on them, he trotted to the center of the road and put his huge nose back to work. Sabrina, however, looked down that long, empty road. They'd been walking for over an hour, and not so much as a bicycle had passed them. If they didn't get a ride back to the house soon, they would be walking all night. The time might have passed more quickly if there was a little conversation. Before the last hour, Daphne had marched ahead of Sabrina, refusing to speak. Even Elvis, who followed closely behind, was ignoring her, but since he was a dog, his silence was a lot easier to bear. "How was I supposed to know?" Sabrina cried. "Anybody would have thought she was crazy." "I didn't," Daphne said, finally breaking her silence. "You don't count. You believe everything," Sabrina argued. "And you don't believe anything," the little girl snapped. "Why are we even talking? You don't care what I think anyway." Sabrina wanted to defend herself, but she couldn't come up with words that rang true in her own mind. Daphne was right. What she thought hadn't mattered in a long, long time. But it wasn't like Sabrina wanted it like that way. She was only 11 years old, but was forced to act like an adult. It wasn't fun being the grown-up, constantly worrying about whether they were safe and fed and warm. Someone had to make the tough decisions, and unfortunately, she now realized she had never considered what Daphne might want. "Your opinion counts, okay?" Sabrina said. "The old woman, our grandma," Daphne corrected. "Fine! Our grandma was just carried off by a giant. We're stuck in the middle of nowhere. I don't have a clue what to do next." "You don't care if we ever find them," Daphne said. "Now you can run off like you planned, with no one to stop you." Daphne walked to a fallen tree trunk next to the road, sat down, and began to cry. Elvis trotted over and nuzzled her, licking the little girl's tears from her chubby cheeks and adding his whines to her sobbing. Sabrina sat down beside them and put her arm around her sister. "Daphne, we're not running away. It's just that monster was real. We can't fight that by ourselves, even if we knew where it took them." My time is up. That's gonna be the last audiobook video for the day, it seems. I'll send